here to address the issue that we had previously taken to court regarding the working and operations of the Office of Director of Criminal Investigation and Office of Director of Public Prosecution. In essence, previously there were some guidelines that were passed, particularly the guidelines on the attack on the terrorism. These guidelines we moved to court, we got instructions from our client and moved to court on one fundamental issue, that all the requisite bodies that ought to be involved or in the preparations, in passing and in execution of the guidelines that purports or fights terrorism were not involved. Now, in the guidelines and in the documents filed or purported to be filed by the Director of Public Prosecution and other agencies, they purported to have involved all the participants. Recently and in court, we have seen an affidavit by Director of Criminal Investigation informing the member of public that indeed he was not adequately involved. Some of the parties that were included in the signing of the attendance of the persons who passed the agency guidelines on fighting terrorism were indeed not present. Some of the persons who signed were outside the jurisdiction of the vicinity where the meeting was happening. So indeed it has come out clear that the signing and the passing of the agency guidelines was stage managed. Not all parties were involved, and it was not to serve the public interest. We know that fight against terrorism is a serious fight that ought to include all the parties. Most importantly, the agency that makes investigations. We know that under the Police Service Act, several bodies have been created, independent bodies, to investigate, to arrest, and also prosecution's body have been created by the Constitution. Fight against terrorism ought to involve all the agencies. It is apparent clear that DCI was not involved in the passing and enactment of the terrorism agency guidelines. In the affidavit filed in court, we have indeed established that the participants who were invited to participate did not meet the threshold. Only a few individuals were handpicked as a show of inclusivity, but in real sense, all the parties that ought to have been present were not present. So we bring to the attention of the public that indeed this country has some agencies working to achieve their ill motives without involving all the requisite bodies. In the fullness of time, we will seek and we await to see the court annul and vacate those guidelines, as they do not serve the purpose they ought to serve effectively, because all the agencies that deal with prosecution of crimes, investigation of crimes, and booking the persons involved in the commission of crimes were not involved in passing the terrorism agency guidelines. Thank you.
Are we set? Andor? Has filed a further affidavit in the petition where we are challenging the guidelines of terrorism. In the further affidavit, 11 key issues are raised by the Director of Criminal Investigation. 1, if a letter to start the process was done by the Director of the DPP, forwarded to the Inspector General. The Inspector General wrote to the Director of Criminal Investigation, one George Kinoti, to appoint officers and send them for that workshop. The Director of Criminal Investigation rejected. He has annexed a copy of the letter where he declined, because that is a mandate of ATPU. After he declined and the letter went back to the Inspector General, the next day a letter again, similar content, was drafted, taken clandestinely as per what George Kinoti is saying, given to his deputy, who was on terminal leave behind the back of the Director of Criminal Investigation. The deputy was recalled from terminal leave. He actioned the matter to the Director of ATPU, Anti-Terrorism Police Unit. Then the program started. The Director of the DCI knew after he declined, no movement is moving on. The process started, an invitation was done. In the schedule of the thematic areas that are supposed to be discussed, nowhere is the question about guidelines is provided as a subject that was supposed to be discussed. What the members attended and did was to describe the job description and the mandates of their respective agencies. They stayed for 4 days in Naivasha, and the guidelines came to be born. In the abstract and in the affidavit of one Noordin Haji, he says there were 3 police officers from the office of the DCI. Those 3 DCI officers have sworn affidavits saying they were never present. The Director of Criminal Investigation has produced a forensic scientific data showing where the officers were. Mr. Kinoti has attached that. Therefore, it is a clear question of forgery of signatures by the Director of Criminal Investigation by saying there were 3 DCI officers who appended their signatures who were not present. 4, the Director of Criminal Investigation has gone further to the hotels where the meetings were conducted and checked the hotel bookings, checked the attendance register, and completely found out that it was a forgery claiming that his department was there. The Director of Criminal Investigation Officer, George Kinoti, has gone further to locate the whereabouts of all these people who signed and whether their signatures were valid because the telephone numbers are there. The data coming out that is forensic is that the document presented before the court are a forgery. The Director of Criminal Investigation has gone further to produce evidence that the principals who were there were not sufficiently represented. The document that was done by a consultant. The Director of Criminal Investigation has gone and investigated the qualification of a consultant. The qualification of that consultant is that he's a lecturer at one of the universities in Eldoret. He has never been involved anywhere in terrorism or prevention of terrorism. He has no qualification, both professional, both expertise on terrorism matters. The only qualification he has is that they share the same religion with the director of the DPP. That is within what, that is the qualification that the consultant had. This is a quack this is a person without any skill, either trained in Israel, either trained in the USA, or trained in FBI, or trained in the art of terrorism. The Director of Criminal Investigation in his affidavit has dug the funding. Who funded the program? The funders were purely from one religious sect to the exclusion of the Christian faith. The director has provided enough facts to show that the guidelines, one, failed the test of participation because all the stakeholders were never involved. The judiciary, which is the largest consumer, was never involved in what was going on in a version. So in essence, the director, Mr. George Kinoti, has demanded that, one, proper investigations be done on somebody who has done forgery, that is the DPP, with a view of him recording statements and him being arrested and being charged for the offense of forgery. This is a serious attack on the person who is the custodian of prosecution in this country. If indeed he can forge, then he's arresting people and charging them for forgery. What mandate does he have to stand and say he's the Director of Public Prosecution? Two, we are taking this file, after we have found this affidavit, we will seek instructions from our clients to pursue still the matters before the Public Service Commission, where we had sued one Noordin Haji for incompetence. And now we have serious evidence against him, so that he should be removed from office for being a criminal suspect. Nowhere in Article 157 did anybody imagine that the Director of Public Prosecution can involve himself in matters fraud, in matters that are criminal in nature. So that is the evidence that one George Kinoti, through the Director of ATPU, has signed. Some of the principles, for example, the asset recovery, the director, the boss there, was out of the country. So if signatures of people are being superimposed on documents like this one, what moral authority does the Director of Public Prosecution have to stay still in office? The affidavit we've shared with the media, it is a grave question on what is happening in the office of the Director of Public Prosecution. Arresting, the problem is that the charge sheet must be signed by the same director before the DCI can arrest. But we shall be moving to court asking that the DCI does not need anybody's authority to arrest any criminal suspect, because that is his job pursuant to Article 245 of the Constitution. The mandate to arrest any suspect rests with the IG and the DCI.